Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. All right, so I have Sam Fuhlendorf, who's at Oklahoma State University, and Bob Hamilton, who works for the Nature Conservancy in Oklahoma here, and they're going to tell you what you need to know about PYRIC herbivory and patch-burn-grazing.
PYRIC herbivory, to start with, I always think of them as separate, but very, very, very similar. So PYRIC herbivory, I think of as the interactive process. It's an ecological process where fire and grazing interact as almost, well, they are one disturbance. And then I think of the patch-burn-grazing is using the PYRIC herbivory to come up with a way to manage land that can achieve certain objectives.
Okay, so that's an interesting way. You said PYRIC herbivory is really taking the herbivory disturbance and the fire disturbance and making them one disturbance together.
Right, and then I think of the patch-burn-grazing as sort of like it's the application.
Yeah, so you're taking ecological knowledge and applying it to a management approach.
Right, exactly.
I guess in the conservation community, I would say there's kind of this growing awareness over the last few decades of the importance of heterogeneity or patchiness out there on the landscape or whatever ecosystem you're talking about. You know, marine, freshwater, terrestrial, whatever. All ecosystems have their natural disturbance regimes that constantly reshuffle the patchiness of that system. And so in the Great Plains, I think, like I say, over the last few decades, or maybe even longer, there's been kind of this growing awareness among grassland ecologists that, in terms of trying to pick a little fuzz out of your navel, how did this thing work originally? The general concept is that we had this big, in the Great Plains, humongous landscape. But probably the way it worked was this helter-skelter, fire grazing interaction that resulted in this just tremendously variable, constantly shifting patchiness out on the landscape. Native Americans setting fires, all different seasons. We know from historical accounts, Native peoples were using fire in all different seasons, all different times, all different frequencies for all different purposes.
And you also had large herbivores in the system.
Right. And you had, lightning strike fires. So if you philosophically, if you feel that humans are part of the natural world, that means we need to account for and we need to pay attention to how they used fire, how our predecessors used fire. So in the Great Plains, we think it was this fire-induced rotational type system, patch sizes varying from, fairly small, little patches the size of your vehicle, maybe a lightning strike or something, but then it was put out by rain, up to large, what we would call, wildfire events. Nowadays, it would be, the size of Nebraska or Kansas, something like that. But it was this very unregulated, like I say, helter-skelter sort of system. But that variability out there on the landscape is what's supported and provided habitat for our native species, both plants and animals. So as a conservation organization, if we're trying to preserve biological diversity, which is what the Nature Conservancy is all about, the challenge as a land manager then is how do you incorporate that perspective? How do you bring heterogeneity to the property you're trying to manage? And at any given moment in time, you are providing all these different patch types. Wow, that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because in the research world, the tendency and without, is that basically what we try to do is we study fire versus no fire.
Right.
And grazing versus no grazing. And in the context of what Bob described happening in the Great Plains, that's a little bit of a silly question.
Right.
And
it's not a reasonable treatment.
No, it's actually not reasonable at all. And so, in fact, I often get asked, well, where's the unburned tallgrass prairie? And I say, it's that forest over there,
Yeah. You can't actually have a control. It's just a different length of time since it burned.
Yeah. And so instead of asking, should we burn or should we not burn? The answer to that question is clearly yes. You should do both of those things. And then when we do, we realize that the grazing animals really interact with those fires. And so what happens, and it's counterintuitive to a lot of people, is that you burn a patch. So if you have patches out there, you have, say you have 4 patches and you burn one of them, the likelihood that patch will get grazed explodes through the roof.
All of the herbivores want to eat in the burn patch.
At least, no, I don't know about all of them. Some of them are less so than others, but definitely these big cattle and bison, horses seem to be very attracted. Elk are very attracted.
Yeah, large herbivores for sure.
Yeah, and so what happens is they go there and then they avoid the other areas and they grow up in fuel and
then they're more likely to catch on fire.
Right. So the likelihood of grazing goes up after a fire and the likelihood of burning goes down after a fire, but it goes up in areas that have accumulated a lot of fuel.
Right.
And so that's the interaction with a couple of feedbacks. And then so Bob and others applied that at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, sort of from a broad conservation standpoint. And then we got real interested in trying to talk about how can we translate that into land management strategies. And that's where the patch-burn-grazing comes in.
Right.
And, Bob does random fires. We don't do random fires. We don't let the size vary quite as much as it could because of logistical constraints for doing burns. And so we've come up with a fairly simple plan that's a little bit more simple than the bison unit, where ranchers can burn and have animals congregate, and we've done it as small as 100-acre tracts, and you still get a flush of biodiversity, and you get a lot of the benefits. It's not the same thing, but it's a lot of the of similar things. So, and we found that we can actually even maintain livestock production or even enhance it in some cases.
So you can still manage the cattle production system at a reasonable comparable level, but what happens to biodiversity?
So biodiversity goes up as well. Obviously, if you have a 100-acre prairie, you're not going to have a flock of prairie chickens show up just because you're doing this.
Right. So
because it matters what your neighbors are. They have a bigger.
Right.
But in terms of insects and some songbirds and small mammals, you'll get a change.
Right. And at the landscape scale, if it was being applied ubiquitously, but that's when biodiversity really benefits.
Right. And you get so it's curious that like some of the birds that live on these landscapes, they require it to be almost what we would call abused grasslands. I mean, if you did that every year to the same tract, they're often attracted to prairie dog towns, for example. So that's not what most land managers are trying to promote. And then alternatively, you have some birds that like areas that haven't even been disturbed for several years. So the idea is to try and have all of those on. And one of the ways I like to tell people to think about it, and I view it as a little bit of humbleness, and the idea that we spend all of our time trying to tell herbivores where they have to graze, especially domesticated herbivores, where in reality, I don't think we really know where they ought to be grazing all the time. And so
they probably know better anyway.
They probably know better. And so the idea is that if you have 4 patches, then you're 4 times less likely to be entirely wrong. Yeah. And that actually, and to me, that's a comfort. It's kind of like, well, if you burn everything, then that might wreck your deer hunting next year or whatever you're in. You put more risk in that. Whereas if you only have variation in patches, you can do those things, and it might benefit one year, but the next year it would have hurt it. So but you didn't do it everywhere.
Sure. Well, I think that's great. Really interesting concept, and I like the idea that you're trying to figure out what was going on in the system, how was the system functioning, what was promoting that biodiversity in the system and that stability, and then trying to operationalize that. And it seems particularly complicated in this scenario because you have this shifting mosaic of disturbance that you're trying to mimic, which can be pretty difficult. So I really appreciate you guys taking time to talk to us about that. So thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How Ecology Works. If you're interested in more topics like this, follow us at ufdeerlab.